Chief Petty Officer William Bull Morrison pressed his weathered hands against the steel rail of the USS Intrepid, watching the morning sun paint the Pacific in shades of gold and crimson. The gentle roll of the carrier beneath his feet felt wrong somehow, too light, too buoyant, compared to the solid, reassuring mass of the battleships he'd called home for 15 years. At 42, Bull carried the salt and steel of the old Navy in his bones, and this floating airfield still felt like an experiment that had gone on too long. He'd earned his stripes on the USS California, where 16-inch guns spoke with the voice of God and armor plate thick as a man's torso, promised that when you went into battle, you stayed in battle. Bull had been a second-class gunner's mate then, young and eager, learning the sacred rituals of the main battery under Chief Kowalski, a man who could calculate firing solutions in his head faster than the new mechanical computers they were installing. Those were the days when naval warfare meant something you could see and touch, massive shells arcing through the air, the satisfying crash of metal on metal, the honest work of men and machines built for one purpose. Now, in October of 1944, Bull found himself responsible for ordnance handling on a ship that launched its weapons into the sky and hoped they'd find their way home. The irony wasn't lost on him that they made him a chief petty officer just in time to oversee the loading of bombs and torpedoes onto aircraft, weapons that seemed to him like expensive toys compared to the honest brutality of naval gunfire. The morning air carried the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal, punctuated by the whine of aircraft engines warming up for the dawn patrol. He pulled his watch from his pocket, an old Elgin that had survived 3 years in the Pacific, from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea to the current push toward the Philippines. In 20 minutes, his ordnance crew would begin the first weapons load of the day, preparing Avengers and Hellcats for strikes against Japanese positions on Luzon. The routine had become second nature over the past 8 months, but it still felt foreign to him, like wearing another man's uniform. A young seaman approached, clipboard in hand. Seaman First Class Danny Rodriguez was barely 19, all enthusiasm and energy. The kind of sailor who'd grown up with airplanes and thought carriers were the natural order of things. Bull had been trying to teach him the fundamentals of ordnance handling, but the kid had a tendency to rush through procedures that demanded patience and precision. Bull scanned the manifest, noting the mix of general-purpose bombs, armor-piercing ordnance, and torpedoes scheduled for loading. Each type required different handling procedures, different safety protocols, different ways of thinking about how destruction traveled from ship to target. In the old days, you loaded a shell into a gun, aimed it at something you could see, and pulled the trigger. Now you hung bombs under airplanes, hoped the pilot could find what he was looking for, and prayed the weather held long enough for him to get back. Rodriguez began to speak, but Bull cut him off with a raised hand. Lieutenant Commander James Parker was approaching, and something in the officer's stride suggested this wasn't a routine inspection. Parker had been the Intrepid's Air Group Ordnance Officer for 6 months. A Naval Academy graduate who'd specialized in aviation weapon systems. He was competent enough, Bull supposed, but he had that particular confidence that came with book learning rather than experience. At 31, Parker had never served on anything but carriers, never felt the deck plates vibrate with the controlled violence of a main battery firing in anger. Parker's voice carried an edge that Bull recognized. The sound of an officer who'd received new orders he wasn't entirely happy about. The captain had called a meeting for 0800. Something big was coming up, and they wanted all senior ordnance personnel briefed. Bull nodded, but was distracted by movement on the flight deck above. Through the maze of steel supports and equipment, he could see aircraft being positioned for launch, their wings folding and unfolding like mechanical birds. Even after all these months, the sight struck him as fundamentally unnatural. Ships were meant to carry guns, not airplanes. Guns you could rely on, guns you could maintain, repair, and understand. Airplanes broke down, crashed into the sea, disappeared into clouds. and never came back. As they made their way toward the island superstructure, Bull asked Parker if he'd ever served on a battleship. Parker replied that he'd started on the Yorktown and transferred to the Intrepid when she was commissioned. Bull considered his answer carefully. Parker was a good officer, but part of a new Navy Bull sometimes didn't recognize. He just nodded and said it was a different kind of fighting. The passageways of the Intrepid thrummed with activity as the ship prepared for another day of flight operations. Sailors hurried past carrying tools, ammunition, and supplies, their movements choreographed by months of practice and the urgency of operating in a combat zone. Bull had grown accustomed to the controlled chaos, but part of him still missed the steady, predictable rhythms of a battleship, the ceremonial precision of turret drills, the satisfying weight of shells being hoisted into position, the simple clarity of pointing guns at the enemy and firing. In the ordnance briefing room, Bull found himself surrounded by younger men who spoke easily of bomb loads, fuel mixtures, sealing limitations, and target acquisition. They were competent, dedicated sailors, but they belonged to a different tradition. They thought in terms of airstrikes and fighter sweeps, of coordinated attacks launched from beyond the horizon. Bull thought in terms of standing your ground and slugging it out, of armor and firepower and the honest brutality of ships built to take punishment and keep fighting. The briefing began with intelligence about a major Japanese naval force moving toward the Philippines, including several battleships that had been hiding in port. For the first time since joining the Intrepid, Bull might face the kind of naval battle he understood, ship against ship, gun against gun. But even as the officers outlined the Japanese order of battle, Bull realized the coming fight would be nothing like the engagements he'd trained for. The enemy battleships would be attacked by aircraft, struck from distances their guns couldn't match, destroyed by bombs and torpedoes delivered from the sky. It was efficient, probably more effective than traditional battle line tactics, but it felt like cheating somehow. As the meeting broke up, Bull walked back to his station with Rodriguez, who was chattering excitedly about the prospect of action. The young sailor had never been in a real naval battle, never felt the deck shake with the recoil of heavy guns, or smelled the cordite smoke that followed a salvo. To him, this was all adventure and technology, the kind of warfare he'd read about in magazines and seen in newsreels. He asked if they'd really engaged the Japanese battleships. Bull paused at the entrance to the ordnance storage compartment, considering the question. Through the steel bulkheads, he could hear the familiar sounds of his crew preparing for the day's operations, the rattle of bomb carts, the mechanical whine of loading equipment, the steady voices of petty officers calling out safety procedures. These men were good at their jobs, but they were preparing weapons for a kind of warfare that still felt alien to him. He finally answered that after 15 years learning to fight ships with guns, now he was loading bombs onto airplanes so pilots could do the fighting. He wasn't sure what kind of engagement that made it. Rodriguez looked confused, as if the distinction didn't quite register. Bull wasn't surprised. The kid had grown up in a navy where carriers were already king, where battleships were relics of an earlier age. He'd never known the satisfaction of a perfectly executed gun solution, the pride in maintaining equipment that could throw a 1-ton shell 20 miles with pinpoint accuracy. As Bull began his inspection of the ordnance storage areas, checking the secure mounting of bombs and torpedoes, ensuring that safety procedures were being followed, he had to admit the system worked. The Intrepid had been in combat for 8 months, had launched thousands of sorties, and had contributed to victories from the Marshall Islands to the Philippines. The pilots who took these weapons into battle were skilled, brave men who faced dangers Bull could barely imagine. Maybe it was time to stop thinking about what naval warfare used to be and start focusing on what it had become. Still, as he watched his crew maneuver a 1,000-pound general-purpose bomb into position beneath the wing of a Hellcat, Bull couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost in the transition. These weapons would be carried into battle by individual men in individual aircraft, each pilot making his own decisions about when and how to attack. There was no coordination, no mass firepower, no sense of the ship itself as a weapon. It was personal and individual in a way that naval gunfire had never been. The morning sun climbed higher, and the Intrepid began launching its first strike of the day. Bull stood on the hangar deck watching as aircraft disappeared one by one through the opening that led to the flight deck above, each plane carrying weapons his crew had loaded, weapons that would soon be dropped on Japanese positions or ships or aircraft. The process was efficient, professional, and completely beyond his control once the aircraft launched. Bull's role in the battle ended the moment the planes left the deck, until they returned, if they returned, to be rearmed and refueled for another mission. He didn't trust planes, and never had. They were too fragile, too dependent on weather, luck, and the skill of individual pilots. But watching Rodriguez and the other young sailors work with such dedication and precision, Bull began to realize that maybe it wasn't about trusting the planes. Maybe it was about trusting the men, the ones who flew them, the ones who sent them into battle, and the ones who loaded the weapons that could decide the outcome of the war. The news came at 3:30 on October 24th, delivered by a radio man whose hands trembled as he passed the message to the officer of the deck. Bull was already awake, lying in his rack, listening to the subtle changes in the ship's rhythm that suggested something was happening. When the general quarters alarm sounded, echoing through the Intrepid's steel corridors, he rolled out of his bunk with the efficiency of a man who had done it 1,000 times. In the red-lit ordnance compartments, his crew was already moving with calm urgency, understanding that lives depended on their speed and accuracy. The message was clear. A massive Japanese fleet was approaching the Philippines. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and numerous destroyers. It was the decisive engagement everyone had anticipated, the moment when the war in the Pacific might finally be settled by naval combat. But as Bull supervised the emergency loading of additional aircraft, he realized the battle would be fought entirely in the air. American carrier planes would attack Japanese ships. Japanese land-based aircraft would target American carriers. The great battleships on both sides would serve mostly as targets. Lieutenant Commander Parker appeared beside him, his face tight with focus. They were loading everything. Armor-piercing bombs, torpedoes, every piece of ordnance they had. This was what they had trained for. Bull watched as his crew maneuvered a massive torpedo onto a cart for transport to the flight deck. The Mark 13 aerial torpedo was unreliable, prone to running too deep or failing to arm, but it was the best they had for sinking battleships from the air. Bull had seen the reports. Bombs bouncing off armored decks, torpedoes failing beneath their targets. He told Parker he wanted to double-check the torpedo settings himself. These weapons had caused trouble before, and if they were going after battleships, he wanted everything perfect. Parker cut him off. There wasn't time. They needed to arm and launch within the hour. Land-based bombers were already in range, and the attacks had to be coordinated. Bull felt the old frustration rising. In the old Navy, you took time to do things right. You checked and rechecked. You rehearsed until everything was automatic. When the moment came, your gear worked because you had made sure it would. But now, speed was everything. They loaded as many aircraft as fast as possible, counting on numbers to make up for flaws. As the morning advanced, Bull struggled with the tension between caution and necessity. His crew worked faster than he'd ever seen, but he noticed troubling things. A torpedo not fully secured, a questionable bomb fuse, safety pins pulled too early. Each shortcut saved seconds, but he had seen what happened when ordnance failed at the worst moment. The first strike launched at 0600. 36 aircraft carrying mixed loads headed for the Japanese fleet. Bull watched them vanish into the haze, each one carrying weapons his team had prepared, tools that might shape the battle. It felt strange having so much responsibility for events unfolding far beyond his view. By 800, word came back. The strike had found the enemy and attacked, but results were uncertain. Some pilots reported hits. Others described fierce anti-aircraft fire and aggressive fighters. 3 aircraft were confirmed down, 2 more missing. For Bull, the losses were abstract. He didn't know the pilots, but he had loaded the weapons they had carried into battle, and their fates felt tied to his work. The second strike was larger, better organized, and carried improved ordnance that Bull had inspected personally. He had insisted on checking every setting, every fuse, every safety system. Parker complained about the delay, but Bull stood firm. If these men were going into battle, their weapons had to function. Parker told him he was holding up the launch. Bull replied that everything needed to be set exactly right. They were attacking armored targets, and the margin for error was slim. Parker nodded. In his expression, Bull saw something surprising: acknowledgement. Maybe the old ways still had a place in the new Navy. It was a quiet moment of respect, but Bull tucked it away. The second strike returned with better news: confirmed hits on 2 battleships, fires aboard several cruisers. But 5 aircraft were lost, including 2 experienced pilots. Bull watched the survivors land, saw the damage to their planes, and the exhaustion on their faces. They had flown through fire to hit their targets. As the day wore on, Bull began to understand something that had eluded him. These young pilots carried the same burden he had known on the battleship: the duty to deliver effective, accurate fire under pressure. The difference was, they bore it alone, without the support of a gun crew, in machines that might not survive the mission. During a lull in operations, Bull stood on the flight deck, watching damaged aircraft return. One helldiver trailed smoke, shrapnel through its engine cowling. The pilot brought it in clean, despite what must have been failing controls. Bull felt a surge of respect for the skill and bravery it took to bring a crippled plane back to a moving deck. Rodriguez joined him and pointed out the pilot, Lieutenant Jenkins, flying off the ship for 7 months without missing a mission. Bull watched Jenkins climb out, pale and unsteady. He couldn't have been older than 23, younger than some of the shells Bull had once loaded. But the pilot had the quiet confidence of a man who had faced death and come through it. Bull told Rodriguez to get Jenkins a cup of coffee and make sure he went to sick bay. The young sailor nodded and hurried off, and Bull stood there thinking. In the battleship's gun rooms, you relied on your team: powder handlers, shellmen, captains. Success or failure was shared. Bonds were forged in that responsibility. These pilots carried the same weight, but alone. The final strike launched at 1440, aircraft loaded with the last of the Intrepid's heavy ordnance. Bull had supervised every step, checked every weapon, briefed his crew on the importance of this attack. Intelligence said the Japanese fleet was withdrawing, but there was still time for one last strike. As the aircraft disappeared toward the horizon, Bull realized something had shifted inside him. He still didn't trust the planes. They were too complicated, too fragile, too prone to failure. But he had started to trust the men who flew them. Their courage and skill deserved the best weapons he could provide. Waiting was the hardest part. On a battleship, you saw the results of your fire, the splashes, the flashes, the damage. Here, Bull could only wait for radio reports, scraps of information from far away, fragments of a battle he could no longer see. When the reports finally came in, they told the story of a decisive American victory. The Japanese fleet had been broken up and forced to retreat with heavy losses. 2 battleships had been sunk along with several cruisers and destroyers. American losses were relatively light: 8 aircraft lost, with 3 pilots rescued by submarines and flying boats. Yet Bull found the victory felt different from the battles he remembered from his days on battleships. There was satisfaction in knowing the weapons had worked as designed, that his crew had done their job with skill and care. But there was also a sense of distance, of being separated from the actual fighting, that left him with an odd emptiness. As the surviving aircraft returned to the Intrepid, Bull watched each landing with a mix of relief and professional attention. The pilots looked drained, their faces tight with the strain of combat, But they carried themselves with a quiet pride he recognized. They had done what was asked of them, carried their weapons to the target, delivered them accurately, and returned to fight again. That evening, Bull sat in the chief's mess, sharing a meal with the other senior enlisted men. The conversation was low-key, focused more on preparing for the next day's operations than on the victory they'd just contributed to. One of the machinist's mates mentioned Bull's crew by name, saying the ordnance boys had done well, no early detonations, no torpedo failures, everything worked as it should. Bull nodded, accepting the compliment with a simple reply that they'd just done their job like everyone else. But as he sat there, listening to the hum of the ship at sea, Bull realized something had shifted in the way he understood naval warfare. The old certainties were gone. Battles weren't won by armor and gunnery alone. Ship-to-ship combat and battle lines were no longer the core of strategy. Seamanship and courage still mattered, but now precision, flexibility, and coordination were just as important. The new Navy required trust, in systems, in teammates you couldn't see, in decisions made far away. It demanded faith that weapons launched miles from their targets would still strike true. It was less personal than the old way, but no less demanding. He still didn't trust planes, and maybe he never would, but he was beginning to trust the men who flew them, and the complex system that made their missions possible. He had come to trust his own ability to contribute to that success, even in this new kind of war. It wasn't the Navy he'd joined 2 decades ago, but it was still the Navy, still committed to defending American interests and defeating its enemies. 3 days after the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a letter arrived for Bull, handed to him by a mail clerk who had no idea what it contained. He sat on his rack in the chief's quarters, staring at the familiar handwriting. It was from Chief Gunner's mate Tony Kowalski, his old mentor, now serving aboard the USS Pennsylvania somewhere in the Pacific. Tony had been the one to teach Bull how to calculate firing solutions and maintain a battleship's main battery in those early days. The letter opened with a jab. Tony had heard Bull was now riding a flat top. Must be strange, he wrote, loading bombs instead of shells, watching others do the fighting. He said they had finally gotten into it the old-fashioned way. Battle line against battle line, just like they'd trained for. He described a night engagement where American battleships had crossed the T against a Japanese force and delivered devastating gunfire from prepared positions. It was exactly the kind of action Bull had always imagined when he thought about what real naval combat looked like. But as he read, Bull wasn't filled with envy or regret. Instead, he found himself thinking about what he had seen over the past few days. The carrier strikes had taught him more than he expected. He had worked side by side with aviation mechanics and pilots, piecing together what had gone right and what had gone wrong. Which weapons had failed, which had worked, what they could improve for the next mission. Lieutenant Jenkins, the pilot he had helped after that difficult landing, had come looking for him the day after the battle. He thanked Bull for the coffee, but also wanted to talk about the torpedo he had dropped. He said the run looked good, but he never saw an explosion and wondered if there had been a problem with the arming mechanism. Bull had been surprised that an officer would ask for his opinion, and even more surprised that he assumed it might matter. On a battleship, the line between officers and enlisted men was sharp, rarely crossed, but aviation seemed to create a different relationship, one based on professional trust and competence rather than just rank. Bull explained that the Mark 13 torpedoes had a history of running too deep. If they didn't stabilize quickly after release, they might dive below the target. They had been adjusting the depth settings, but the system was far from perfect. Jenkins nodded. That matched what he'd seen. He asked if there was anything the aircrew could do to improve performance. They talked for 20 minutes, diving into technical details, underwater ballistics, water temperature effects, the critical importance of setting the right depth. It was the kind of discussion Bull never thought he'd have with a pilot. More conversations followed with other aviators, and Bull realized they were dealing with the same challenges he had once faced as a gunner's mate. Understanding their weapons, learning how environmental factors could impact performance, adjusting tactics based on technical limitations. As Bull sat with Tony's letter in his hands, he realized that the lines separating different kinds of naval warfare were blurring. Whether you fired 16-inch shells or dropped torpedoes from a plane, success came from the same basic principles. Know your weapons, understand your targets, and operate as a team. The next morning brought new orders. The Intrepid was to support the landings at Leyte, providing close air support for troops fighting inland against determined Japanese resistance. It was a different mission, requiring different ordnance and tactics. Bull worked with specialists he'd never met before, loading napalm canisters and fragmentation bombs for use against ground targets. These weapons felt more immediate and personal than the anti-ship ordnance he was used to, but the rules were the same. Handle them carefully, install them precisely, follow safety procedures to the letter. Rodriguez showed up with the manifest for the day's strikes. He said the pilots were asking about the delay fuses on the fragmentation bombs, specifically whether they were set for ground burst rather than air burst. Bull nodded, appreciating the level of thought. Air bursts were better against exposed personnel. Ground bursts were more effective against gear and fortifications. The pilots cared about that distinction. It meant they were paying attention. As the day moved forward, Bull found himself getting into the rhythm of close air support. Aircraft launched in small waves, hit targets called in by forward observers, and came back quickly for rearming and refueling. The pace was relentless, and the margin for error razor-thin. But the direct connection between the ship's operations and the success of American forces ashore gave Bull a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. During a short break between strikes, he ran into Chief Aviation Machinist Mate Williamson on the hangar deck. Williamson was overseeing repairs on an aircraft that had taken small arms fire during a strafing run. As Bull approached, Williamson looked up. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, not stopping his work. "Some of the younger ordnance handlers are struggling with the timing on these close air support missions. They're used to having more time to prep weapons. The quick turnaround has them nervous." Bull considered the comment. Williamson was right. Close air support required a different tempo from fleet operations. Faster work without sacrificing precision. It was the kind of pressure that separated seasoned sailors from those still learning the craft. "What do you think would help?" Bull asked. "Cross-training, maybe," Williamson replied. "Let your ordnance guys work with my plane captains. Let them see how the weapons fit into the aircraft systems, and maybe send some of my people into your spaces, so they understand what goes into prepping those weapons." Bull nodded. It made sense, even if it went against the grain of traditional Navy practices. On a battleship, divisions stayed in their lanes. Gunners didn't need to understand fire control, and fire control didn't worry about powder handling. But aviation seemed to call for a more connected system where everyone had to understand the larger picture. "Let's try it," Bull said. "Start with a few volunteers from each side and see how it goes." The cross-training program that followed was informal and improvised, but it had a powerful impact on how Bull saw his role aboard the Intrepid. Working with aviation specialists, he began to see how ordnance handling was just one piece of a complex, coordinated system. His decisions about loading weapons didn't just affect a single plane. They influenced entire missions. He also started to grasp the human side of this warfare. The pilots weren't distant figures anymore. They were professionals who depended on his crew's expertise and whose survival reflected the quality of the work they did. He began to respect their courage, their ability to fly damaged aircraft back to the ship, their precision in hitting targets under pressure, their willingness to undertake missions that sometimes seemed impossible. These weren't abstractions anymore. They were men he knew, and their success or failure was tied directly to his own. One evening, Bull found himself in the ship's library, reading technical manuals on aircraft systems and weapons integration. It was voluntary study, the kind of thing he had always done to stay sharp, but this time the purpose was different. He wasn't just learning for himself. He was trying to better support the people who flew the aircraft he helped arm. Lieutenant Commander Parker found him there, bent over a section on torpedo attack profiles. "I wanted to thank you for the cross-training effort," Parker said as he sat down. "We've seen a real improvement in turnaround times. The pilots have noticed, too. Higher reliability with the ordnance." Bull looked up. "Just trying to do the job better, sir. These pilots deserve the best weapons we can give them." Parker nodded slowly. There was something in his expression. Something thoughtful, as if he'd come to a realization. "You know, Chief," he said, "when I first got assigned here, I thought carrier operations were mostly about learning new procedures. I didn't realize how much it would change the way I think about naval warfare." "How so, sir?" Parker paused. "On a battleship, you're part of one big weapon. Everyone works together to make that single platform effective. Here we're supporting dozens of individual weapons, aircraft. Each one has its own crew, its own mission, its own risks. It's more personal, more reliant on individual trust and cooperation." Bull thought of Tony Kowalski's letter about the battle where American battleships had crossed the T against the Japanese fleet. That kind of warfare had a purity to it. Clear goals, direct engagement, a shared sense of power and purpose. But this new kind of combat, built around aircraft, demanded something different. It required trust in each individual. It was more complex, less visible, and more human in its reliance on small personal acts of skill and courage. "Sir," Bull said at last, "I think what we're learning is that it doesn't matter much whether you're loading shells or bombs, whether it's ship to ship or air to ship. What matters is doing your job well enough that the people who depend on you can do theirs." Parker smiled. "That's probably the best summary of naval service I've heard in a long time, Chief." That night, as Bull returned to his quarters, he thought about writing back to Tony. He'd congratulate him on the victory at Surigao Strait, acknowledge how important that battle was in the war's bigger picture. But he'd also try to explain what he'd learned on the Intrepid, how carrier warfare had taught him to think differently about service, about teamwork, about duty. He still didn't trust planes, maybe never would. But he had learned to trust the men who flew them and the system that kept them in the fight. It wasn't the Navy he had joined 20 years ago, but it was still the Navy, still worthy of his best work and deepest loyalty. In November 1944, the Intrepid faced a new kind of enemy, one that would test everything Bull had come to believe about trust, duty, and the changing face of war. The ship was operating near the Philippines when the first kamikaze struck. A lone Zero dove from the sky, its pilot determined to trade his life for damage to an American carrier. Bull was on the hangar deck when the general quarters alarm sounded. The bark of anti-aircraft guns followed almost instantly. He had heard those guns many times, but something about the urgency told him this was different. Through the steel of the ship, he could hear the deep booms of the 5-inch mounts, the frantic rhythm of the 40-millimeter guns, and finally, the desperate stutter of the 20s, the last line of defense. The impact rocked the ship. Bull felt the deck jolt under his boots, heard the metal scream as it was torn apart, smelled the acrid tang of burning fuel and scorched wiring. In the stunned silence that followed, broken only by the rush of damage control crews, Bull understood that everything had changed again. Rodriguez appeared beside him, pale and shaken. "That plane flew straight into the flight deck," he said. "Didn't even try to pull up." Bull nodded, already moving toward the damage control station. He had read the reports, had seen the intelligence summaries, but knowing kamikaze attacks were possible was nothing like witnessing one. It wasn't just damage, it was deliberate sacrifice, personal, terrifying. The hit had been serious but not catastrophic. The plane had slammed into the flight deck just aft of the island, burned through the planking, and ignited fires on the hangar deck. 3 sailors were dead. 11 more were wounded. But the fires were contained quickly, and within 2 hours, the Intrepid resumed limited flight operations. Still, the psychological damage lingered. Bull could see it in the eyes of his ordnance crew, hear it in the way conversations dropped off when aircraft approached. Everyone on board now knew that every plane in the sky might carry not just bombs, but a man willing to die to take them with him.